Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the SEL Global Leadership Series. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief with the Knowledge Hook Signature Leadership Series. Thrilled to have you here today. Our topic is SEL and intrinsic motivation. We have three partner organizations that got together in March of 2020 to respond to the need to talk more about SEL. Post-pandemic or during the pandemic. And it's hard to believe that 16, 17 months later, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. And we certainly have realized that this is a topic that needs to continue. Our first partner organization is Karanga. Karanga is a global alliance for social emotional learning and life skills. And we're an organization, I'm part of the executive as well as Dominic, and we are thrilled to talk about advocacy, connected communities, implementation support, and cutting edge research. So you're welcome to join us and take a look at the resources there. Our second organization is Salzburg Global Seminar. Salzburg Global Seminar is a not-for-profit that emerged just after the Second World War. It is charged with bringing forward current and future leaders to talk about creating a better world. And there are a network of fellows that are in countries right around the world. It's an amazing organization. And again, I encourage you to take a look at that. Our third partner organization is Knowledge Hook. It is a Canadian digital math company, and we offer thought leadership to senior education leaders. Again, all the resources are free. You're welcome to just go on to knowledgehook.com and /leadership and create an account and join us and access the resources that are there. So we are very thrilled to say that we have a great group of registrants today with us. We've got registrants from 8 Canadian provinces, from 18 states in the US, and from 21 different countries. So lots of interest in the topic of intrinsic motivation, and we've got an incredible panel to help us with that discussion today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my wonderful colleague, Dominic Regester. He is doing amazing work at Salzburg Global Seminar at Karanga and has a particular talent for hosting these kinds of events. And I'm going to pass it over to Dominic to introduce to you Sharath and Cynthia, our fabulous panelists. Dominic, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jen, and welcome everybody to this round table. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think we're talking about the intersection of three really important trends in education at the moment. So social and emotional learning, which has obviously been the focus of the whole leadership series, but then also the role of dignity in education and work, and intrinsic motivation and how those three things interconnect. So we have two fantastic experts joining us today. So Cynthia Guyer is a senior advisor with Global Dignity and also part of the steering committee of Karanga, and it's been amazing to have the chance to work with and learn from her over the last 12 months or thereabouts. And Sharath Jeevan is the founder and executive chairman of Intrinsic Labs, and also critically for today's conversation, the author of a really brilliant new book called Intrinsic, a manifesto for reigniting our inner drive, and really looking forward to getting into the conversation. As always, for everyone joining, please feel free to use the chat function on Zoom to engage with one another, to comment on what's being said, to share resources if you know of things which are pertinent to the conversation and that you think will be of interest to other people, and to engage with one another and post questions that you would like me to bring to the attention of the panelists. And we'll try and get through as many of the questions as possible in the hour that we have together. So I'd like to kick off by bringing Sharath onto the stage, if that's okay. Sharath, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. As I said in the introduction, I think the book's fantastic. I've really enjoyed reading it over the last week. So congratulations on that. I think it's an absolute success. But I would love it if you could start off just by introducing the topic of intrinsic motivation to everyone and saying a little bit about what was your motivation in writing the book.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. I'm so glad you've enjoyed the book. Yeah, so I often think about life a bit like a long Indian car journey. I spent many years in India over the last 10 years. And if you think about it, the type of fuel we put into the car is a bit like the type of motivation that drives us. So extrinsic motivation or external motivation, things basically doing something because something else is promised at the end, it's a bit like a car powered by diesel. You get the fumes, it's not a very pleasant ride. You get from A to B though. Intrinsic motivation is really doing something because it's inherently fulfilling, satisfying, rewarding in its own right. And it's a bit like gliding on that electric car, the Tesla or whatever version you like. There's not much pollution or contamination along the way. You also get from A to B, but a bit like the good cholesterol, bad cholesterol sort of example. The more we can live our lives according to intrinsic motivation principles, these concepts of purpose, autonomy, and mastery that I'll unpack in a second, the more likely we're going to be happy, fulfilled, and in the long term successful in our lives. And what's interesting, I think the reason why this is such a topical conversation is that our education systems, for us as teachers, those of us who are educated as school leaders, but also critically for our children and young people, they're becoming increasingly extrinsic and moving away from that principle. And that's causing all kinds of cancers to grow in our system and in us as professionals and for the children we ignite and nurture.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're seeing this proliferation of extrinsic drivers, given, we're more than a decade since Daniel Pink's book on Drive, which did a lot to popularize ideas around autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But with your analysis, which I think is completely valid, society and work and systems are moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I think what happened, Dominic, I think there's been 30 years of really rigorous research about these core pillars of purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Let me just explain them for a second for those who may not be familiar. Purpose, as I define it, is about how what we do helps and serves others. It's a bit like the GPS, the destination we enter into our GPS, to use the car analogy. The autonomy is us being at the wheel, really feeling in control of our lives. And in India, many people in the back seat telling you how to drive. It's you ignoring that and keep going. And mastery is becoming that better and better driver as you navigate everything from cows to pedestrians and Indian roads. It's becoming the best version of ourselves we can be. And so we've had 30 years of rigorous research on these concepts being valid in a whole range of domains in our lives at work, but also in education systems. What's been really tricky, and that's what inspired me to write the book and also to advise organizations through Intrinsic Labs now, is that how we put this stuff into practice is much murkier. And I founded probably the world's largest intrinsic motivation initiative. It was called STIR Education. That reached 35,000 schools, about 7 million children, 200,000 teachers in emerging countries. But I was flying blind. It was literally like the University of Life and just trying to figure this out as we went along. So I think that ability to really apply this stuff in practice has got to be where we now focus. And I think the thing that's really bedeviled our ability to do this is that we have not been honest with ourselves about what the purpose of education is for. And again, remember, purpose is about how we help and serve others. We've been deeply confused about that. And so what instead, we've been a bit like, drunks the lamppost. We've used it, measures and measurement for support rather than illumination. As Mark Twain once said, we tend to focus on what's easy to measure, not what is really most useful for our young people in the longer term. And I think that's the real core of the problem that we've got ourselves into now, the quandary that all of us in education now face.
So it's a kind of consequence of the 19th, 20th century industrial model of education that is no longer in many contexts fit for purpose. And we need to move beyond that.
Yeah, I think I talk about in the book this idea of a kind world and a wicked world. And a kind world is where, there are stable technical solutions to our core problem. So think about Elon Musk and SpaceX getting to Mars, an amazing achievement, but there was a solution. Engineers could design a flight path and so on, and we got there. Within days of that amazing achievement, again, Black Lives Matter erupted across the US and of course around the world after that. That was a classic wicked problem. There's no way you can ever sort of solve quote unquote inequality or racial injustice or police brutality, any of these things. So more and more of our world is becoming wicked in terms of the problems we need to solve to get to our next level of human progress. The challenge is our education systems have become more and more kind, and we're almost going back to Victorian notions of what education is there for. That's why I think this conversation is so important, because all the research I did in the book around what really is the purpose of education it really seemed to center on this idea of young people becoming lifelong learners and developing that learning to learn muscle that will enable them to succeed in this world of unknown unknowns. And if the last 18 months haven't shown us that world, then nothing else will.
Thank you, Sharath. I'd love to, Cynthia, I'd love to bring you in to the conversation. And welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. So Global Dignity was set up to teach the concept of dignity, and particularly, and I'm quoting from your flyer, every person's equal and inherent value, to promote inclusion, equality, and a greater sense of our shared humanity. There's some really interesting interconnections with the social and emotional learning, social and emotional skills landscape, and lots of what Sharath is talking about. So yeah, welcome, and would love to hear some of your opening reflections.
Yes, thank you so much for having me in this panel, and thank you for all the great work you do, and everyone who's out there for all that you do with teaching and learning and education and youth empowerment. Just by way of context, I worked before Global Dignity, which works in 80 countries and reaches about 1 million students and young people, children a year. I worked for almost 25 years in US public education districts and systems, always from the community, and primarily working with principals, teachers, and parents, trying to build strong learning communities in high poverty, low income public school, urban districts. And the questions that Sharath was just talking about what is education for, is the context for Karanga's work and Global Dignity's work. We have not dropped this old system that we inherited from the industrial age of kind of drill and kill and memorization and route learning and teachers giving lectures and kids being passive recipients. We haven't been able to shed that as we transform, everything's transformed around us to require these other sets of learnings and skills for kids to reach their full potential as workers, as community leaders, as global citizens. So, the backdrop of my experience was in working with large urban school districts, the pressure on teachers and communities and kids to do academic content exclusively and never even enough time to cover all the content required by districts, by states, by United States Department of Education, crowded out much ability to really have living laboratories of these other skills we're talking about, which, as Sharath said, are the skills that young people need to survive and thrive and feel like they belong and that they have purpose and that they can make change in the world. So as Andrea Schleicher said from OECD last week, you would have thought that the pandemic had given everyone a jolt, ministers of education, governors, presidents, that we need to attend to these softer skills, life skills, social and emotional learning, intrinsic motivation, creativity, curiosity. But, sad to say, he said he feels like most nation states are going the other way. So it's really a dilemma. But for us, we've been out there in 80 countries like a living laboratory, everywhere from Mongolia to Portugal, working with the Ministry of Education here, where I live now, to El Salvador, where schools aren't open to this. So we work with youth community-based groups. And basically, this notion of dignity relates exactly to intrinsic motivation. If someone doesn't feel, a young person, or think about people in your own life, your family, if they don't believe they matter and that they have worth, they can't have the motivation, they can't have the confidence, they can't reach their full potential. And the rising rates of depression and suicide and really hopelessness about the future, everyone is measuring that now, and it's going up for young people everywhere, including in affluent communities. So we've got this crisis, and I think the only way through it is to focus on these new ways of saying what learning and education and teaching is. So for us, dignity is this bedrock of helping young people in school, in youth community groups, in refugee camps, really begin through storytelling, interactive workshops. We have a bunch of links for people today on how to get started in this, but really finding their own worth, their own value, overcoming the challenges they face, overcoming discrimination for whoever they are, based on color of skin, based on gender, based on background, based on religious beliefs, and all the ways that we hurt each other and that children hurt each other. And the other part of dignity for us is how we look at others. Once we find our own voice and confidence, how we look at others, no matter what those differences are, and rejoicing and celebrating the dignity of every other human being, no matter how different they are. So I think this gets right to this idea of how do you unlock that black box of finding someone, having someone really take charge of their lives and their learning and their destiny and their future. How do they reach their full potential? Dignity is core to that, we believe.
So could I ask you to say a little bit more about some of the teaching dignity resources that Global Dignity has produced and how they might be relevant or useful for this conversation?
For people today, we have links to everything, but we have about 52 what teachers would call lesson plans that we developed with the first director of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who was now 15 years ago, very sensitive to the kinds of issues that Sharath talked about, of really rethinking education and its purpose along the lines of this conversation. And he helped us find 3 teachers who had taught overseas, and we developed really simple, interactive, storytelling-based lesson plans, what we call learning experiences, about 15 for little ones, 5 to 9, elementary school age kids, and the rest, the majority for 10 and up. And we find that people are using this with, seniors and refugees and in disability centers and homeless shelters, because really it's about finding your sense of purpose and your voice and feeling like you matter. And once you discover that, treating others the same. So we believe that this takes work and it takes focus, and you can't leave it to chance, and it needs to be a part of every young person's learning, whether it's in this place we call school, or whether it's online, or whether it's in a youth-based group, community-based group, or in places like refugee camps where we have millions of young people growing up today with no teachers and no place we call school. So we have those. We have, during COVID, we converted some of our most popular interactive workshops to virtual learning experiences. So we have guides for about 6 different teaching resources on dignity that are really user-friendly, very simple, and again, are all story-based and interactive.
Brilliant, thank you. And like you said, there'll be links coming at the end of the discussion. I really love how you're describing the kind of the motivation for developing this body of work around dignity, and I think it resonates really strongly with some of the drivers for why we wanted to establish Karanga and some of the early thinking about social and emotional learning, and social and emotional skills being really about skills that help you live with yourself and find purpose, skills that help you live with other people and develop empathy and relationships, and then skills that help you design and plan your career and the external life that you want to lead outside of your relationships. And I think, throughout the book, Sharath, there are lots of points of contact with those things, but I wonder if I could ask you to say a little bit about where you see the interconnections between social emotional learning and intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. And I was thinking about this and what the right sort of metaphor is. I like thinking of metaphors sometimes. And I think the big mental model shift we've been talking about, all of us, is this idea that, we used to think social emotional learning or 21st century skills, whatever words you want to use, was a bit like the icing on the cake. And I think more and more we're seeing it as the cake itself. I think I'd almost think about intrinsic motivation as one of the key ingredients. I'm not sure, my baking skills are not amazing, but I'm not sure it's the flour or the yeast or what we would talk about, but it would be the key ingredient to make the cake actually whole. So I think unless kids engage deeply in what they're doing in school, they're unlikely to develop these 21st century skills. So whether it's curiosity, critical thinking, we've had 5 C's, 3 C's, whatever, whatever classification you want to use. It's what we're learning a lot about the school process, I think, is that the engagement lever is a really, really important one for kids. If they are deeply engaged in whatever the content or the subject or the context is, it's likely they're going to be developing these skills that are inherently transferable. And just to give a sort of a real example, actually, I started my career in the world of strategy consulting, quite a high-flying world and a very glamorous world in some ways. But the partner who used to do the interviews would not ask the normal questions. He wouldn't say, ask how many ping pong balls are there in the world or a business case study. He'd just ask you to talk about something you've done in your university or school or outside. And his idea was that if you had gone deep in terms of engagement in these things, you would have developed curiosity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, influencing all of these elements. And so I think what we need to think about is, how do we set up our school experience or classroom experience so that engagement comes to the core of what we're doing? And I think if that happens, and there are more and more ways to measure engagement, we're finding behaviorally and quite simply, that's likely to really, really create that ripple effect. And the last thing I just say on this is that I think we're also learning that relationships and role modeling of teachers to children is really important, perhaps more than the content itself. So for the book, I talked to the head of a foundation in Brazil, the Lemon Foundation, and she told me the story where, for many months during lockdown, Brazilian kids were taught, they also couldn't go to school. They were taught on TV. Most households, even in favelas, have TVs. They were taught by the best teachers in the country by TV teaching. But it didn't work. And we asked kids why, and they said, look, this is not my teacher. There wasn't that relationship there. And I think that role modeling, if the teacher themselves, if we are engaged as educators, we're passionate, motivated, it has a massive role modeling effect on children. But if you look at the UK, where I'm based right now, 40% of our teachers want to quit the profession. So you've got this dichotomy of sort of what it's like to be a teacher and what we're trying to promote in our children, and it just doesn't match up. We've got to find a way to make these things more congruent and more whole.
And Cynthia, you mentioned the OECD report on social and emotional skills, and there's some really interesting data in there about the importance of the relationship between teacher and their students in terms of motivation. And presumably, with your work with teaching dignity and global dignity, you would see dignity as a kind of pivotal part or critical part of that whole relationship.
Yeah, I mean, my work in the Portland School District, which at the time in Oregon was the largest urban school system in the Upper West, was that many teachers felt in the systems that we built in America that they weren't treated with dignity, that they were basically just told what to do and couldn't innovate and couldn't do the kinds of things they felt they needed to do with their students. So, I mean, we have enormous pressures and need leadership at all levels of, school district leaders and school boards and ministries of education who will help us turn the ship around. But one story I can tell from a teacher that we're very close to in New York City, in Brooklyn, Mike Wilper, he teaches 6th grade, and said he spends mostly all of September doing dignity work with his 30, 6th graders. And he said before he did this work on finding your own dignity and understanding others, the classroom was out of control. You got girls, you got boys, you got this sort of just mean girl stuff going on and one-upmanship, and you've got half the kids feeling disempowered and sort of not present and not belonging. And he said once he really did this work as a teacher with telling your own story and listening to other people's stories and really getting to this notion of the dignity between these 36 young people, that the whole climate of the classroom changed. Like each individual, and he measured this by like results on test scores and, the quality of writing of these students over the years. And basically each individual student started to blossom because they felt safe, they felt they belonged, they felt heard, they felt understood for all of their, whoever they were. And the classroom started to form a living community based on trust and empathy and listening to each other. And so, I mean, he's going to write a book on this and said that this is where kids blossom, when they finally feel understood and belonging and they accept others with their full dignity. And then things just start to happen for learning, for the individual, and on academic performance. So I think it's really powerful what we're saying. My work with teachers over the years and with, thoughtful school principals is people are hungry for this. Every webinar I go on with teachers, this is what teachers want to do and do well. They know there's the need, and they know if it's ignored, that basically you have, up incidence of depression, of mental health. We're reading lots of articles about that with this generation, with teen suicide. The stats in America, in American public high schools, are 30% of kids just do what they told and they're gonna sail through. 30% have their eyes glazed over. They're just listening to the stuff. It's going in one ear, out the other. And 30% walk with their feet in the American high school, where it's just so meaningless and so purposeless that they just leave school and drop out. So we've got a crisis. And I think this is the kind of work we're talking about, is what teachers want to do, what kids want, and that we have to figure out how we can get some leaders and some places that we can point to that are doing it and show that it works.
I think that the point your colleague in New York has made about using academic improvement as a really effective proxy for measuring the impact of these of this kind of intervention or innovation is really valuable. We've seen, I think, very powerful case studies from Delhi with that as well, with the happiness curriculum, where after the first 2 years, I think it was, they used the increase in academic results as almost the only measurement indicator of the efficacy of what they were doing. And we've had a question about measurement on intrinsic motivation. So Sharath, I wonder if I could bring you in to answer that specific question, then also for the next few minutes, if we could ground our conversation in kind of practical tips and tricks for any of the teachers who are on the call today. But first of all, the question about measurement, Sharath, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. So I really struggle with this personally when running STIR. And I think one of the things that I was really reflecting on was that I think that, again, what often we started seeing, or there was a temptation for school systems to see intrinsic motivation or socio-emotional learning as a tool to get academic outcomes, right? And the challenge with that is that it's almost like the cart and the horse. We've got them the wrong way around, literally. I think what we're finding in the world of work now, I spend a lot of time talking to employers. They don't care really how, my son is 10 and he's got a crazy exam in the UK at this age. I'm helping him, and some of the stuff he's doing, and reflexive pronouns, I'm a published writer. I've never had to, I know what it is. I can, but do I need to name it or know it? Some of the stuff he's doing, and is this really relevant anymore? And how useful is it? What matters much more, I think, is to measure the outcomes around engagement, motivation, and socio-emotional learning much more directly, and see them as important, maybe even more important, because certainly in the world of work, it's the human elements of jobs now, the wicked elements, right? Where there's no easy technical solution. That's the stuff that will not be automated. And that's what all of our work is going to move towards. So I think we need a really strong rebalancing of the measurement systems. It's easy to measure academic outcomes, which is why I think we're often doing it. But that's a very dangerous way of going there. So I would really call for better proxies for us to measure things like student engagement. And I was looking for the book about a university in Australia had found a very interesting student engagement index. It wasn't perfect, but it looked at everything from attendance in school all the way through how kids were engaging in lessons, and had a few composite measures to do that. So I think we've started this process, and much of it can be behavioral. We can measure it directly in classrooms as well. But I think really seeing this as an important end outcome, not just as a convenient intermediate outcome for academic results. So,
not in service of anything else. It's done because it's the right thing. It's both the smart thing to do and the right thing to do.
Exactly. I mean, can I just pick on just that, because I think it links to another question about the this whole question of how do we avoid groups falling behind, I think, as well. So one of the things I also looked at very closely for the book was around this idea that what is the core role of a teacher? I know it sounds like a crazy question, but actually, what is the core role? And increasingly, I came to the conclusion that there were to be a talent nurturer. Basically, have they taken their students to a place they wouldn't have got to otherwise? I looked at other examples of talent nurturers from the performing arts, entrepreneurship, sports, top chefs, business people, etc. And that idea of that teacher who takes us to that different place. And I got to Cambridge University for my undergraduate degree really just because of the stubbornness of a single teacher who physically almost dragged me in the back of a car, waited outside admissions offices while I went in and wouldn't leave me till I did it. So I think that's the kind of people that I think we need in today's world, which is this really wicked world. And as Cynthia said, soaring rates of anxiety. I studied in Palo Alto, they've got had man guards on the trail tracks to avoid kids jumping off to commit suicide. It's real, right? These are wealthy kids as well. They're not disadvantaged kids. So I think that role of the nurturer of as a teacher is more and more important. What's happening instead, I think, is we, and not by design, but by default, we're ending up having to select more. Our job as teachers to hit these scores and these targets is the easiest way to do it is select the best kids, and we've become talent managers, not talent nurturers. And one of the key ideas in the book is how can we regain that moral standing as teachers and make that difference? Take our children to places they wouldn't have got to otherwise. And I think we can get to that place. I'm very optimistic.
You talk on a number of occasions in the book about kind of needing to overcome the winner takes all zero-sum dynamic in education, and then also in wider economy and wider society. Yeah, and
so I have Indian parents, and the narrative when I was growing up was you've got to be the top of the class, right? Indian immigrants to the UK, in a classic immigrant mentality. My mum, though, she's a doctor, but she grew up in a fairly sleepy city, where it was sleepy at that time in India. She had 30 girls in her class that she could compare to, and she could be the top of her class. Now, any of our kids can go into social media and see thousands of people look like them. We're never going to win this comparison game. And I think if we set our motivational dial to be about being better than someone else, it's doomed to failure. That's why we have these crazy rates of anxiety and depression and all the things Cynthia talked about. I think if we move the motivational dial to ourselves and this idea of mastery, not competition, us progressing, us developing. And I know there was a question about maths, that so often in maths, we get sorted early on. You're good at maths, you're not good at maths. And you very quickly, back to dignity, have these labels about yourself. Instead, it doesn't matter where you start from. Are you getting better each day? Are you seeing progress? That's deeply motivating. You put more effort in and you go on a positive spiral between motivation and mastery as well.
One of the things that we have been exploring with Karanga and with some of the social emotional learning work at Salzburg Global that helped lead to Karanga was the need to develop multiple different advocacy arguments depending on who you are engaging with. So there is, I think, a compelling and legitimate employability, or the social emotional learning skills, social emotional skills are critical to do the kinds of jobs that won't be outsourced to AI or algorithms in the near future or partially outsourced. There's an equally legitimate argument which is about mental health and well-being. And when we started thinking about Karanga, it was pre-pandemic, and I think one of the reports that influenced us really significantly was a piece of research from the World Health Organization that had said, based on current trends back in 2016, I think it was then, depression was likely to be the largest cause of adolescent illness and disability globally by 2030, and that was pre-pandemic. Then there's an equally compelling argument around the academic uplift that SEL interventions can offer, particularly for students in disadvantage, and and so on and so on. You can carry on with many more different advocacy positions. And it feels like, there's something similar that could be done around both the work for global dignity and the work around intrinsic motivation. And that, for educators who care about these reform topics, we need to have these different advocacy arguments to hand so that we know which ones to lead with, depending on who we're trying to convince or who we're trying to influence. And is that work, Cynthia, that that you've been involved with dignity, and you have different arguments, you forefront different arguments or pieces of evidence at different points?
Yeah, we're really coming at it from a how do how do you grow people? How do you support people to find their voice and be all they can be, so that they don't have depression, they aren't suicidal, that they aren't despondent or hopeless about climate or inequality or their prospects for a good life. So we really came at it from a youth development perspective, but through Karanga's work, I think I've really learned, Sharath talks a lot about this, and we were also born out of the World Economic Forum. There's a lot of dialogue there about the system. If we could just tear the education system down and redesign it, we would design it around these universal skills of curiosity, problem solving, working in diverse teams, having empathy, good listening skills, critical thinking, curiosity, all of the stuff that is embodied in what you call social and emotional learning, and what Sharath talks about. How do you kindle this intrinsic motivation in each and every young person? So that's, whether you take it from a mental health, well-being perspective of our children and of the adults that they are going to become, or you take it from the world of work, what it's going to look like in 10 years, we don't need all this content. And the teachers are saying, I don't have time for these other skills or to learn how to be this kind of teacher because they're cramming this content down. They are the victims of, a system that was architected for another time in another world. And it's very hard to change big national school systems and ideology. But I think the hope that I see from Global Dignity's perspective is that so many people are having this conversation all over the world, and that there are some pioneers. One that I think of a lot is Beacon House in Pakistan. They're also in 4 other primarily Muslim nations, but they're educating 350,000 young people now in Pakistan. And not only the elites through an IB system of schools, but also through their tuition, they educate about 150,000 kids from, very poor communities. And basically their learner profile for what every young person needs to know and be able to do at 17 is all about what we're talking about, not the academics. But I have their learner profile here. It's problem solving, analytical skills, curiosity and being inquisitive, empathetic, creative and innovative, ethics and ethical, digitally literate, and perseverance and grit and motivation. Those are the things. And if a school system of 350,000 sets those as this is what we want children to be able to know and do when they graduate, that's what they architect all the way down to kindergarten. So they have a system of schools where this is happening every day. And this can happen in government school systems too. I'd also like to say the Aga Khan Foundation is rethinking all of their university and K through 12 education module with MIT, just thinking we are not teaching the skills and the abilities that children need for this changing world. The Dalai Lama has quietly been working with Emory through the SEED initiative. I think they had thousands of people coming to India before COVID to unveil their first curriculum, which is really about, empathy and compassion and understanding people's differences. So there's waves of people who are doing this work, which is really encouraging. But I think it's needs to speed up.
There is momentum and a movement building, and lots of, I think, affiliated initiatives that overlap and complement one another. I mean, it's a kind of proxy indicator, and a slightly crude proxy indicator. But with Karanga, we did some social media analysis across 2020, looking at the frequency with which terms like SEL or social emotional learning were mentioned across social media platforms, and only in English, when you ran it in English. It's obviously a limitation, but you saw a really interesting arc where, by May, June time, I think you had almost 3 times the number of mentions of those terms as at the beginning of the year. And this was at peak school closure globally. And then come September, October, as more and more schools reopened, the frequency with which those terms were being discussed, or at least mentioned, began to tail off. But by December at the year end, it was still significant. It wasn't as high as it was at the peak, but it was significantly higher than it was in January. So, there was a kind of spike in interest and relevance because of what was happening in the pandemic, and the year finished with more discussion of these topics. And I think, this momentum is building, which is why why your book is so brilliantly timed coming out now.
Thanks, Dominic. But I want to say something because I know many people in the room are teachers, and I know maybe the question, okay, these are all great big picture ideas and trends, but how do I change right now? And what I would say, I think the reason why I'm very optimistic is I believe actually that as teachers, we have a lot more autonomy than we think. And about autonomy, again, our ability to drive the wheel of our own car, if you like. Our kingdom is to a large extent our classroom. Our classroom is to a large extent our kingdom. What's happened is because of the fear and compliance culture that we've created in many of our systems, we don't feel that autonomy anymore. And I spoke to teachers all over the world actually around this area, and I had one in the UK where they had an Ofsted's our regulator in the UK. They were so scared about this that even the work on the wall of a child, there were height restrictions, how big the work had to be, how many displays on the wall was being specified by the school, and how can you stay motivated in that piece. And what I would say to this group of really amazing educators, let's all be a bit more pirate, essentially. There's actually a bigger autonomy window than we think. I think the key thing is to make sure you get people behind you. And I think most parents are sensible. I talk a lot about parenting in the book, but we're deeply confused. I've got 2 young boys. We're told one thing by our governments and our ministers that we patently know is not true. We all work as well, right? We're in the world. So I think if you just explain to them, look, the reason I'm going to be teaching, I will cover the national curriculum, let's say it's the UK, but I'm going to do it in a way that really brills the things that Cynthia just talked about, curiosity, critical thinking. When you see homework, it won't be the normal homework because of this. I think, honestly, most parents would be absolutely fine and would really embrace and welcome that. If you can bring your school leader or your senior leader who you report to and explain that as well. There's an increasing term being used in the world of work now called job crafting. The idea that you don't need to take a job description as standard. We can craft that to our own interests and passions and motivation. Have that honest conversation with your employer, talk about it, and also explain the nonsense that you may have to be doing. Like I talk to many teachers who spend a day a week entering data into spreadsheets. I'm not saying the data is not important, but why are they the people doing that? Could there be a software platform or a volunteer, or many other people could be doing this rather than someone that's a huge cost of time. So I think writing down what I call in the book the cost of inaction, explain to the people around you why this is so important and why the status quo is not good. That can start to build the case for change. And just one last tip, I think if you can take, I know schools, I'm sitting now in East London near a place called Tower Hamlets. It was traditionally quite a deprived area, a big Bangladeshi community and so on. Many kids in this area have never ventured into the city of London. It's half a mile away, literally. So often I think it's about opening up eyes and, talent nurturers, getting kids to be to places they wouldn't have got up to otherwise. It's about building new connections, new patterns, new relationships. Take them into a law firm and let them see what happens in a law firm, an accounting firm, or whatever, police department, whatever. And so I think the more we can change mental models as teachers, we have that incredible power to do so. I think we can build change and momentum to really make our classrooms better and more engaging and motivating.
So just sticking with that idea and the kind of some practical examples that you've both come across or both seen that have really worked in terms, that teachers could implement tomorrow or this evening or this afternoon, depending on where they are. If you had to give a couple with all the global dignities in 80 countries, Sharath, you had some really interesting case studies from Indonesia, from Uganda, from India, but also from many other countries around the world. What would be the top practical recommendations you would each make?
Well, for global dignity, we're like a living laboratory of people, in Bangladesh. Our country chair is doing this work, the dignity work with the Rohingya children. Half of the million refugees are children. And, they've been traumatized and don't have a lot of sense of their own dignity or hope about the future. So this work is very powerful there. all the way to Portugal, where our country chair is talking about how you do this for an entire school system. How does Portugal start to rethink its K through 12 curriculum to encourage more of this kind of learning and approach to learning? So, we see people doing it all over. And I think one of the things that our leaders asked us to do, which is why, we're sharing it widely and freely everywhere, is to develop curriculum that people could just, a teacher, a parent, a youth group leader, somebody working with children in a refugee camp could easily take and just start to put into practice. So nothing, you don't have to have a PhD to do the work that we've put together, and people are doing this and adapting it all over the world. And then, as I said, there's some systems like Beacon House, like Portugal, that are really taking it to scale. And I think we need to really keep in touch with those efforts and get to these questions of how do we show that it works and that it's a better model of education than the one that we're trying to leave behind. Kind of the scale and impact issue. But I just, anyone who's on the call who wants to use our resources, go to it.
I would add a lot, Dominic, because Cynthia covered it very well. But just someone mentioned in the chat, Pep McRae's book. I really like it. It's a very practical, nice set of things. I spoke to him actually as part of my research as well. But one of the things I'd say, just to give an example, you mentioned Indonesia. I was in a school where I watched the child had some special needs. I saw a teacher, the parent, one of the senior leadership team, a counselor, and a special needs educator sit around the table and discuss the mastery goals of the child, right? And it was nothing particularly fancy about it, but just the fact that the sense that we're often as teachers, we feel like we're alone, and often we're competing against parents, and the pressures of modern parenting, which I talk about in the book, are that we bombard our children with extra tuition. In the UK, it's a £2.5 billion industry, about $3 billion. We bombard them with extracurricular activities. They're shuttled between activity to activity. We've outsourced all of this, and there's almost created that sort of sense that parents and teachers are fighting against each other for attention of the child, and what's real, what does the child care about most? It's ridiculous. So we've got to work together. Just having that transparency of really helping kids be motivated, develop mastery, and letting them set their own goals, but making it sure that we are there to be those nurturers around them. I think if we can reorientate what we do in the classroom around that vision, a lot of really positive progress can happen.
I would, not wanting to overly play devil's advocate, but it's one thing to say that, and then it's another thing to try and implement it when you know that, in many ways, student success and your success as a teacher is judged by different standards. And how do you navigate, in both of your areas of work and expertise, how do you navigate that tension or the conflict between, what we know to be right and what more and more evidence is saying, and what needs to happen in order to help students thrive outside of the classroom?
Well, for me, it's my conversations with the 6th grade teacher in Brooklyn. Since I was based in New York, we had long talks about, he had to convince his school leadership and the parents who were on the board that the work that he was doing was valuable and should not be stopped. So, you would think a progressive school in Brooklyn would get it, but they didn't, because it was a new way of working with kids. And I think that's why he tried so hard to demonstrate and do some evaluation of how the kids, once he did this work, thrived. Each individual thrived, and the whole classroom, the classroom management, the tone of the class thrived. All the other teachers that were having, disruption and all the things that happen in 6th and 7th grade, he had calm, he had people listening, he had young people taking responsibility for their own learning. And of course, he's a teacher who did a lot of project-based inquiry. So he was already a teacher who was inclined to teach the way Sharath taught. The problem was when the kids walk in the room and they're not centered and they don't have a sense of their own belonging and their own dignity, or someone else's. All kinds of things go wrong in those classrooms. And so that's why the dignity work is so important. So I think for me, a dive into his classroom to show that if you do this work, not only is it good for the individual student, not only good for classroom dynamics, but it actually gets better results on what the school values, on what parents value. So there's something in there that I think is part of our advocacy to people who are asking the questions, which they will.
Can I just add, Dominic, to that, I think we are, as teachers or educators, we are school leaders, we ourselves are beings that need to be motivated, right? And all of the work that I've seen on my work around sort of work motivation is that people who stay motivated have a deep sense of purpose. They know how their work helps and serves others. What was a little bit alarming doing the research for the book was talking to head teachers or principals, teachers across the world who said, my job is now to serve Ofsted or serve our accountability regular or serve that get our school high up in the league tables. No, that's not. I'm sorry. It's to help and serve your community and the young people that you're here to ignite. So I think if we anchor that back to that core thing and see the regulator or the league table as like what motivation thinking calls a hygiene factor. You've got to make sure you look decent on that. There's a little bit of a game you've got to play there as well. But that's not why you exist as a teacher. That's not your purpose. And let's disentangle that, because even if you try and play that game and you see that role, you will not be motivated. That's why 40% of our profession wants to leave. The only way to stay motivated is to remember and reconnect with the core purpose of our work, that ability to help and serve others. I got a couple of things in the chat about the book, and I'm sorry it's not yet available in the UK and US and Canada till next year, but you can get it on Amazon UK. I promise it'll be worth the postage costs. But the reason I said that is in the book, I don't have time to explain it now, but I talk about a 4-step journey for how we can make a motivational change and how to sequence it in a way that takes the risk out of it and keeps building momentum and motivation along the path.
Great, thank you. I'd like to finish, if it is okay, with a question to each of you about how you think the pandemic will have impacted on your respective areas of work, and whether, now that more schools are open than this time last year, whether you're seeing an increase in interest in the topic, or has there been a return to the sort of relative safety and security of knowing how to do what we did pre-pandemic, and whether you think there is a kind of a sort of moment of an opportunity for much greater collective advocacy around dignity, intrinsic motivation, and the new thinking around that, and social and emotional learning.
Well, I think what Andreas Schleicher said on the webinar that you hosted last week was very sobering, that because he's in touch with the people who run school systems all over the world, from his position at OECD. So he's privileged to be in lots of meetings with those kinds of leaders. And he said, unfortunately, you would have thought that it really gave a jolt and a perspective to leaders about how this conversation is important, but he's not so sure. What I see underneath that is that there's just thousands, maybe millions of teachers, parents, small school experiments, either in public government systems, many of them charters and private, who are forging ahead with designing the kinds of learning and teaching that we're talking about, and relationships of this place we call school. I remember being on a July call during the pandemic with Vikas Pota's T4 teacher network. There must have been tens of thousands. And they did these polls throughout the conversation, and it was overwhelming that teachers were saying, this is the kind of work we want to do. This is the kind of classrooms and relationships with students and young people that we believe is why we got into the profession. So I think there's a huge, and I do think that the mental health, the depression, the poverty, the disconnection that's happened during this 18 months has given real people, real young people, parents, communities, and teachers all the more validation that this is where things need to go. And I think in the work world with AI, if you tune into the masters of the world at World Economic Forum, they're all talking about this. And most of them say they would just like to tear the current system down and build the system that we're talking about from scratch. So much easier to do than moving the Titanic. So I don't know. I mean, I think this is a movement that's going to keep going because it's absolutely where things need to go for teaching and learning for the next generation. So I think what's really needed is a few countries, a few big urban school systems, a few ministers of education who lead this work and start to take it to scale and show that it's the way of the future.
Getting closer to that tipping point, hopefully. Thank you, Cynthia. Sharath.
Yeah, just very, very brief. I know we're running out of time, but just to say, I've been talking to teachers across the UK where I'm based, and that sense that, the education secretary he's just been fired today, but is going to save us, that's gone out the window, I think, with the pandemic. I talked to teachers who literally were moving food parcels around the community to make sure kids were fed, making sure that loved ones were taken care of, were safe, were kept there. And I think that the moral purpose of teachers, and that sense that we're not here to serve a league table or all this nonsense, it's come to the fore through the pandemic. And I really hope that, I agree with Cynthia, I think our leaders have not changed enough, but I think we as individual professions can do so much more if we connect to our own intrinsic motivation and dignity and focus on those for our children. So I'm very optimistic, but I think it does mean we have to be a little bit more pirate and a bit less subservient to our so-called leaders.
Well, thank you both ever so much. It would have been lovely to carry on talking with you for hours and hours longer. We're going to share some links to some of the resources that Global Dignity have produced and to Sharath's book in a second. But yeah, thank you ever so much to both of you for all of your time. And Jen, I hand back to you.
Thank you, Dominic and Sharath and Cynthia. An amazing discussion. And as Dominic said, here is the link. As Sharath has said, it's only available through Amazon UK right now, but will be hopefully shortly in Canada and the US. So that's great. And here are the links, description of what Global Dignity is, as well as links to the incredible resources that they have there. Just a quick comment. One of the comments that came through was the whole question about SEL and racialized groups and things that Dina Simmons has done a great job of, questions that she has raised. And I'm thinking in a future session, Dominic, it would be great to be able to have Dina come and join us and talk about how we make sure that we get this right and we don't make some of the mistakes that we've done with measuring academic skills. So that would be great. We have some podcasts on the Signature Leadership series, and we have just done a podcast with Andy Hargraves on his new book about 5 paths of student engagement. And Sharath, as you were talking, this whole concept about intrinsic motivation and student engagement so closely linked. That podcast is now live where you normally pick up your podcast. So you're welcome to jump in and access that. In addition, the good news is that we have an upcoming roundtable where we will talk about return to learn through an equity lens, and the privilege to have Dr. Tyrone Howard and Dr. Sean Harper, who lead racial and equity centers at UCLA and University of South California. They have written incredible books, and we'll be sharing a great discussion on Wednesday, September the 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern. So look forward to that one, and hope that many of you will join us for that discussion. So just to round things out, Sharath and Cynthia and Dominic, an incredible session, really appreciate it. And we wish all of you a good rest of your day and rest of the month of September. Take care, and we'll see you next time.